I'm going to do some demos for you in this video. So when we're talking about occupations in early childhood, there are three main areas, just like there are certainly for OTs working with adults in the adult world. When we're looking at self-care skills as a OTA, PTA in early childhood, in the school system, you could be asked to look at positioning for feeding. You could be asked to assist with achieving motor milestones, crawling, walking, high kneel, transitioning between positions, sitting unsupported. You could be asked to work with children rolling over a therapy ball or a peanut ball to do some nice weight bearing and get some shoulder stability, to get some trunk support, to work on posture and trunk tone. You could be asked to work on dressing skills. So, the typical zippers, buttons, snaps, laces, yes, but typically that happens, 5, 6, 7, depending on the fine motor ability of the children that you're working with. You could be asked to do the backward chaining method for dressing skills, which means that you complete all of the steps of the dressing task. So, for example, with lace tying, you would walk the children through it. You would imitate how to tie a lace, and you would give the steps and the verbal directions, and then they would do the final step so that they feel like they have achieved something and that they've been successful. And then they would do the last 2 steps and then the last 3 steps. And so with practice and repetition, you could be working on those skills. You could also be looking at using adaptive tools. So you might have children, we use, sock aids, and they might be working on a one-handed buttoning method if they have cerebral palsy or a stroke or any of those kind of disorders where they might just be using one hand. You could be asked to work on, zipping up a jacket and different positioning techniques to try to make that easier, or working on putting on their AFOs, taking off their AFOs, working on putting on their own hand splint or taking it off. You could be asked to go in and just make sure that the educational assistant in the school, who is likely working with some of these kids that you'll be working with, is having an okay time putting these dressing aids on and off, or the splints or AFOs on and off. You could be asked to, certainly OTs would look at accessing the washroom. You might just be asked to go in and help with the routine of using the washroom or a visual schedule. They might have a grooming program in place, brushing their teeth or brushing their hair at school. So that could be part of your role. When we look at productivity for children, okay, so that's the second area. Productivity for children is really most of the skills and tasks that they're going to be doing at school. So for physiotherapy, you could be going in to help with strength program, range of motion program, coordination. You could be looking at wheelchair use. You could be looking at using a walker, walking down the hall or navigating around the classroom. You could be asked to be addressing some alternative gym activities. So they might be on some mobility equipment in the school, like there are roller racers and scooter boards that they might be using during gym time because the regular gym program is difficult for them. They could be in a wheeled stander, and so you might be working with them to independently mobilize their wheeled stander during a gym class. That's a common thing to do. You could be asked to work on balance program, motor planning skills, again, transitioning between positions. So younger kids spend more time on the carpet. So you could be working with them on the carpet, doing some high kneel, playing with blocks and building things in high kneel so that you're activating shoulder and you're working on core and you're working on transitioning between high kneel. You might even be doing things like working on side sitting and working on pushing up into extension. So now we're getting into some of the OT related things. We have lots of kiddos that don't spend a lot of tummy time when they're younger. So tummy time is crucial because we need kids to push off of their hands on the floor so that they can build extension in their back. They can build shoulder stability. They can build some strength and stability in their elbows. They can build wrist stability. And also that they are going to get some of the intrinsic muscles of their hands are going to develop through weight bearing. So when kiddos don't spend that kind of time doing that in infancy and as toddlers, we might be incorporating some of those things into the school program. We might be working on, I mean, kids that don't crawl, we see them have trouble with bilateral coordination. I can tell when I'm working with a kid that didn't crawl because they've kind of got the limp fish hands. They've got very, very flat arches. If you look at the arches of your hands, you've actually got vertical arches and horizontal arches and diagonal arches. And so a lot of OT programming might be based on building hand strength, building those arches into their palms. We want kids to be grasping things. We want them to be grasping real objects, because what happens in this day and age that we live in, they have access to phones and tablets. Well, that's great in terms of they intrinsically seem to know how to use them, but they're not getting any fine motor skill development happening. They're not getting any strength built into their hands because touchscreen is so easy to do. They also are growing up in a world where they have Velcro shoes, and so they're not being required to learn how to tie their shoes. And shoelace tying is a typical skill of childhood. Kids should be learning this at about 5 years old. They're more than capable. They have the fine motor skill to do it. That being said, kids actually need to be given tools that are going to help them develop fine motor skill. So as OTAs and PTAs, you could be spending quite a bit of time working on the combination of things like rolling on a peanut ball out onto their tummy to work on posture and core strength, but also from an OT perspective, I want them to be weight bearing on their hands and pushing off the floor with their hands so that they develop some of those muscles in their hands that are going to help them. When it comes to building muscles in their hands and looking at shoulder stability and elbow stability and wrist stability, that's going to impact how they hold a pencil. So I really want them to have a nice, strong grasp and some strength in their hands so that they can work towards holding a pencil or even holding some crayons. We would recommend crayons for little kids because they actually have resistance and require them to build some hand strength. If you think about the bumpy texture that comes from writing with a crayon or writing with a piece of chalk, that actually gives those little minute feedback that goes to their brain that's going to help them integrate information better than if they use markers on a whiteboard, because there's no resistance there. So those markers just kind of slip along the whiteboard and don't give them any feedback. So we would look at using crayons. And can you see how small this crayon is, or how small this little piece of chalk is, or little sponges like this? Look at how I have to hold this sponge or this piece of chalk. I am really required to just use those 3 fingers. So, from your anatomy, you should know that these 3 fingers are innervated by the median nerve. These 2 fingers are innervated by the ulnar nerve. So they are separately innervated, and they have different skills and strengths. So these fingers, the ring finger and the pinky finger, they're actually designed to tuck into the palm and rest on the paper so that when kids are learning to hold a pencil and move a pencil with dexterity, that they are holding it with these 3 fingers here. That's a tripod grasp. That's an ideal grasp for kids to use. And that's something that we would start to look at around 3 or 4 years of age. We want to do as much as we can to try to promote a tripod grasp, and so you might be working on their pencil grasp with them. We need to make sure that we have a flex thumb on the pencil, that it's pointing to the tip and that it's resting here on the side of this tall finger. That's ideal. You might even be asked to work on putting something under, stabilizing these 2 fingers so that they can tuck them into their palm so they can learn how to write with these 3 fingers. Because as soon as we need to do dynamic finger movement for writing, we want these 3 fingers because these are the ones that have more receptors to the brain, and these ones are designed for the intricate fine motor control. So if you think about anything that you have to do that requires very delicate movement, if you wear glasses and you have to put those tiny little screws in with the tiny little screwdriver, you're going to use these fingers because these are the ones that are designed for dexterity. These ones aren't. So the problem is if we get kiddos that, first of all, you're going to see them holding this with a pencil or a crayon with a fisted grasp. They might actually hold it like this to begin with. That's a very immature grasp. That's about a 2-year-old. And a 2-year-old is really looking at doing lines down. They might be scribbling. This is kind of the pre-printing order for strokes. So the first thing they're going to do is learn how to scribble a line down and then a line across, and then they're going to start to scribble in a circular motion right around 3. But a 2-year-old is probably going to hold a pencil or a crayon with a fisted grasp like this, or they may hold it with a fisted grasp like this. This is slightly more mature than this, because if you think about how they feed themselves, oh, I forgot to mention that feeding is probably something that you might be asked to work on, even just adaptive spoons or forks and working on bringing that spoon or fork to their mouth. That could be something that you're working on as well. So this is a little bit of a more mature grasp for a 2-year-old, but what you're going to notice is 2-year-olds tend to hike their shoulders up, and a lot of the control as they're coloring or scribbling comes from that shoulder joint. So they don't have a lot of endurance, because that's actually really tiring and really fatiguing. You're also going to see that the helper hand just kind of hovers above the page. They don't really know that this hand has a job. So as they start to develop, when they're progressing into, typically developing 3-year-olds, we would see the 3-year-old now starting to work towards doing a circle and a cross. So this is integrated lines. This is really the age where we want to start introducing the concept of a tripod grasp. So this is a triangular pencil, which means that I have an area or a side for each of those 3 fingers. So something like that could work, except look at the length of this pencil. So what can happen is kids the longer the writing tool is, the more surface area they have, the greater the tendency for them to spread their fingers out. So they might end up holding it way up here. They might spread all of their fingers out. So look at what happens. Remember the fingers that I told you were developed for fine motor control? So if they spread all of their fingers out and they're holding a pencil or a crayon like this, they are now controlling it with this finger, and that's not the finger that was designed for dexterity. So this is a kid that's going to be using their whole arm and activating their shoulder for writing, and they're going to get really, really tired. They're not going to be able to last very long with any kind of writing activity. So that's why we really want to work on having them stabilize these 2 fingers and get that tripod grasp developing as soon as possible. If they potentially have that 4th finger coming along for the ride, can you see how that's jumped up there? That's okay. I don't typically try to change that, because that 4th finger might be jumping along for a bit of stability. So that's not a big deal if it's a quadrupod like that. It's a big deal if it's a quadrupod like this. And I really don't want grasp. Sometimes you'll see kids grasping like this. Sometimes you'll even see odd things like some kids will use their other finger to push the pencil along. So that's a kid that really needs a lot of work in terms of working on moving these fingers with dexterity and control so that they can work on the continuous stroke of writing letters and printing. When we look at our 4-year-old is starting to work towards diagonal lines. And so they could be 4 or even 5 by the time a diagonal stroke integrates. Now, the thing to think about with diagonal lines is we could have kids that actually aren't crossing midline. So you could be working on helping a child to cross midline. So what that means, you may already know this, but if you see a kid that's writing like this and then midway through they switch to their other hand, that means they're not comfortable crossing that invisible midline of their body. And so we might ask you to do things where if they've got something in this hand, I'm going to present something over on this side where they're going to have to reach across and pick something up with that hand, or I'm going to force them to reach this way. I might actually stand behind them up at a vertical surface on the blackboard or a whiteboard or whatever we've got, and I might actually give them a bit of stability behind their shoulders and then get them to do a big diagonal line this way and a big diagonal line this way and this way and this way, so that they're working on crossing the midline of their body. We can do that in play, on the carpet. We can do it as part of a printing program or a pre-printing program with our pre-printing strokes. The 4-year-old really should be developing that mature grasp. Certainly when we look at babies, it's innate for a child to pick up a Cheerio or a little piece of cheese with that pincer grasp. But as soon as we introduce a tool that is something that has to be taught. And so we might spend quite a bit of time working on the proper grasp with a young child, because it does have a significant impact on their ability to write legibly and their ability to sustain their endurance for writing at a later age. If you've got a kid that has a thumb wrap like this, that's actually going to put a lot of pressure on the thenar eminence here. And that's a kid that has a closed web space. So see how that web space is closed versus when I have a tripod grasp, I've got a nice open web space here. And so that allows for that dexterity and intricate movement there. So if I've got a closed web space, I'm actually going to probably use my whole arm for writing, and that's going to fatigue me as well. So we really want to be paying attention to these kinds of things. Those are the things that OTs might be asking you to work on. They might, they're really going to be focused on having nice stability at the shoulders, stability at the elbow, and stability at the wrist, because that is how we get working towards a tripod grasp. So if you look at the wrist, I want you all to just bear with me, okay? Do this with me. Flex your wrist forward and then try to move your fingers. Now flex your wrist back, put your wrist back into extension and move your fingers. Can you feel how much easier it is to get dexterity and movement there? Because as soon as we flex our wrist forward and we try to move our hands, we're actually constricting the ligament that goes over the carpal tunnel. The carpal tunnel ligament that goes over those nerves into the hand. And so what happens is with a flexed wrist, they end up using their whole arm, and again, they get fatigued. So we want to have stability at the wrist, that wrist extension. So we might be asking you to do things like work on a vertical surface with a child, because once we get them up onto a vertical surface, it's very hard on a vertical surface to write with a flexed wrist. So we might be up on an easel or the wall. We might have them on a slant board. There's even some suggestions of lying under a table and writing this way so that they are writing up, so that they, again, build some wrist extension. We could also suggest that you have them lying on the ground, weight bearing on their forearm, so that they're coloring or writing on their with wrist extension so they can build some dexterity. What else might you be doing? Okay, so there are pencil grips out there. So we might have you try some pencil grips. There's certainly grips that will help prevent that thumb wrap like this. That's like a grotto grip, Grotto. There are other grips like this. This is the claw. Not my favorite. Some kids really like it. I feel quite constricted in this, but look, there really is no other way to hold that pencil than with those three fingers. So you might be working on something like that. Or this is a much more subtle grip. This is the stetro grip. Okay, so my thumb is going on the star here. There's a molded place for this index finger to go. And then there's actually a trough kind of for my tall finger to lie on. So you might be asked to work on using a pencil grip like this. Now these are teaching tools that we use to try to give them a position to put their fingers, but recognize that they could still hold this pencil wherever they want, even with a pencil grip on it. So, I mean, they can be helpful, certainly for some of our older kids if we're trying to reteach a pencil grip, or teach a little kid for the first time how to use it. But I've had limited success with pencil grips. So it's a possibility that you might be asked to do that. We will probably ask you to work on a bunch of different sensory mediums. If you're going to be working on printing skills with a kid, and that's a common thing for OTA PTAs to do. We're going to ask you to use crayon because of the resistance and the strength that's required and the extra feedback that they're going to get kinesthetically and tactilely. We might ask you to use chalk. We might ask you to use wiki sticks, which are like little waxy sticks, to form letters, to learn how to put strokes together to form letters. We might ask you to have them roll out with Play-Doh to build letters. Play-Doh is also going to be a really great way to build some hand strength. We have something called therapy putty as well, which I'm sure you've looked at with your adult population. We use therapy putty a lot with little kids because they like it, and we can do things like hide little objects in the therapy putty, so they actually have to dig through it and pull it and get them some proprioception. So proprioception is that input to their joints. So if you have kids with really weak hands, we could use therapy putty to build some grasp strength. That's also, kids with weak hands or poor proprioceptive input are going to struggle when it comes to writing because they're either going to be really light on the paper or they're going to have a really firm grasp and they're going to press really hard. So we want to give them nice fine motor warm up with their hands, whether it's weight bearing or playing with putty or playing with Play-Doh, to warm up their hands for writing so that they have more input when they're ready to go do their printing. We should see that translate to better rhythm or better pressure on the paper. So there are lots of things that you could be asked to do. You could be asked to go up onto a vertical surface and practice using the Blackboard. If you think about targeting when we're learning how to do letters or strokes, some of these pre-printing strokes, if you actually move your arm up and down, so do that with me. Again, bear with me. So move your arm up and down like this and see how that feels like up and down. Now just plant your hand as if you're going to write and move your fingers up and down. Can you feel the difference in the feedback? This doesn't feel like up and down. This really feels like up and down. So when we're working with little kids, we really want to exaggerate that and use gross motor movement to target the proximal joints because it gives better feedback to the brain before we go to the fine motor joint, because they're not going to get the same level of integration of that information. So we go gross motor movements using these joints, then we do some sensory motor, Play-Doh, sand, salt, crayon, chalk. We could have a water bottle and spray colored water on snow, or any number of sensory mediums we might ask you to use. And then we go to the fine motor. So that's kind of some of the printing skills that you might be asked to work on. We might also ask you to work on cursive writing. So cursive writing for some of our kiddos is developmentally appropriate around grade 2 or 3. Now again, developmentally appropriate at that developmental age, not necessarily the grade. So for kiddos that have a learning disability or dysgraphia, or kids that have had a stroke or an acquired brain injury, the research shows that they're actually better off to learn cursive writing. And for some of my kids that have just developed really bad habits, I'm actually probably going to be more successful instead of trying to fix their printing skills, because most kids aren't going to tolerate having you come in and work on relearning certain letters, particularly the longer that they spend writing those letters from an incorrect motor formation habit. Those patterns become ingrained and it becomes much more difficult to remediate or to change how they make those letters. So I might actually have a lot more success in working on cursive writing, especially if I've got kids that start their printing letters at the bottom of the page. We actually want them to start from the top because your hand is designed to draw down from the top for writing, and it becomes much more efficient to start letters from the top. But with cursive writing, it's actually a bottom starting language. So I might be more successful switching to cursive writing. And it also has the connections between letters. There's a flow that develops. And the research tells us that it gets the two hemispheres of the brain talking. And so there's neurological development that happens when kids learn to cursive write. Another accommodation you might be asked to look at, and certainly OTs will look at, is using technology to augment or to accommodate for kids that really have visual motor difficulties or fine motor difficulties that significantly impact their ability to write. They might even have a processing issue. And so we might look at augmenting that or accommodating that with technology. So you might be asked to work on keyboarding programs, or even just looking at different ways to access the computer. It might be to use, we've got, a trackball mouse or a specialized mouse for, can they even learn how to control the mouse for targeting skills on the computer? Do they get that eye-hand coordination between I'm moving the mouse and something's happening on the screen? We might ask you to trial iPads or tablets to see if that direct touch access is actually a better way for them to access technology. So there, and we could even be looking at using switches. So for kids that have difficulty with communication or are just into that early cause-effect stage, we might ask you to work on using a switch. So they hit a switch and then something happens. We have switches that can activate radios and fans to blow into their face, or bubble makers, or little toys that make noise and walk across the table. But we also have switches that will interface with a computer, or an iPad. And so they can, I mean, obviously an iPad, they're going to touch that screen, which is probably the better way for them to do it. But a switch can certainly interface with a computer, because sometimes we have to go with a computer over a tablet or an iPad because computers have some specialized software. So you might also be asked to use and work on some specialized software. Like we've got speech to text or text to speech or word prediction. There's certainly a number of different computer programs out there that OTAs and PTAs might be asked to work on with a child. Obviously, all of these things would be trained by the OT, and the program would be designed specifically for the child. But this really gives you a good indication of some of the things you might be asked to do in the school. So the last area that you might be looking at in terms of occupational performance for early childhood is leisure. And leisure could be any kind of rec program. So the physios have lots of rec programs. We've got kids playing sledge hockey. We've got kids doing wheelchair basketball. You might be assisting them to access those types of activities. And then we've got play. We've got play where we actually might be working on the social skill of teaching them how to play with others. But then we also heavily rely on using play as a tool for therapy. So kids that might not be overly interested in working with you or doing what you want them to do, we can usually get them to do what we want them to do through play. So if I want them to work on shoulder stability and I'm in a classroom or I'm in a treatment center working with a child, I might start to build something with blocks, or we might play with Lego, or we might take those big blocks and start building a tower. That's going to help them to work on, they could be working in high kneel, they could be working on shoulder strength and stability and activating those shoulder muscles. And they might not even realize that they're doing therapy, but we're using play as a therapy tool to help them build and develop skills in the areas that we want. Okay, I've been talking for a lot. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to give you some handouts. Those will be posted on Blackboard. So when you're watching this video, certainly feel free to fill in some of the areas of the handouts. I'm going to purposely leave some of those areas blank so that you can fill it in for yourself, and then you've got a copy of notes for you to study from. I hope this was helpful.